High Fleet Admiral Corvath laughed as the human woman fell, executed for the crime of standing her ground. He thought Earth was a burnt-out cinder. He thought humanity was broken. He didn't know her partner had just broadcast their coordinates to a graveyard, and the dead were waking up. The sound of the localized plasma discharge did not echo. The command deck of the Vorn Hegemony Dreadnought Obsidian Crown was acoustically dampened, designed to absorb the noise of war. Instead, the execution sounded like a sudden, violent exhalation of breath. Captain Sarah Jenkins, United Earth Naval Intelligence, collapsed to the polished obsidian floor. The kinetic force of the plasma bolt had punched cleanly through her thoracic cavity, instantly cauterizing the wound, but the sheer thermal shock was enough to stop her heart before she even hit the deck. Commander David Holloway did not scream. He did not thrash against the 4 hulking Vorn subjugators who held his arms pinned behind his back. The physical restraints, digging into his shoulders, tearing at his rotator cuffs, felt a million miles away. His entire universe had just condensed into the 3 meters of cold black flooring separating him from the woman he had flown with, fought beside, and loved for 15 years. A disappointing species, High Fleet Admiral Corvath rumbled, his voice a deep, synthesized baritone filtered through his atmospheric collar. The Vorn was a massive, chitinous biped, clad in ornate, ceremonial armor that spoke of a culture where military rank and religious divinity were one and the same. You claim to represent a starfaring coalition, yet you shatter like glass under the slightest pressure. Corvath stepped over Sarah's body, his heavy, digitized optics locking onto David. The human emissaries had been captured 3 cycles ago near the Perseus Vale. Their ship, the stealth frigate UES Magellan, had been crippled by a Vorn gravity snare. They had come under the white flag of parley, carrying an offer of a border treaty from the remnants of the United Earth government. Corvath, recognizing only strength and dominion, had seen the treaty as a confession of weakness. She possessed the command codes for your hidden orbital shipyards, Corvath said, wiping a fleck of ash from his gauntlet. I gave her 3 opportunities to provide them. She instead quoted poetry to me. A tragic waste of cognitive function. David stared at Corvath. His face was a mask of bruised stone. His jaw was locked so tight he could taste the copper tang of blood from his own gums. He wasn't looking at the alien admiral. His eyes kept drifting back to Sarah. Her blonde hair was splayed across the dark metal, catching the harsh blue glow of the bridge's holographic tactical tables. You have no shipyards left, do you? Corvath taunted, leaning in close. The smell of the Vorn was like ozone and rotting copper. Our long-range telemetry of the Sol system shows nothing but debris fields and irradiated planets. Your United Earth is a ghost story you tell yourselves to stave off the reality of extinction. You are scavengers playing at being an empire. David took a slow, agonizing breath. Beneath his ribs, nestled tightly against his sternum, a micro-transponder the size of a grain of rice was waiting. It was tied directly to his and Sarah's biometric telemetry, a failsafe designed by Earth's darkest strategic minds. If one heart stops, the other turns into a beacon. She wasn't quoting poetry, Corvath, David whispered, his voice raspy, broken, yet terrifyingly steady. Corvath tilted his massive head, his mandibles clicking in amusement. Oh? And what was the human female babbling about before her termination? Coordinates, David said softly. She was reciting the navigational telemetry of this vessel, factoring in the drift, the quantum displacement of your engines, and the exact dimensional frequency of your shielding. Corvath let out a harsh, barking laugh. Impossible. Your primitive comms arrays were stripped from you upon capture. You are in a dead zone, human, deep within hegemony space. No signal can pierce the Obsidian Crown's jamming field. You're right, David agreed, a dark, terrible light finally entering his eyes. A standard radio frequency wouldn't make it out of this room, but quantum entanglement doesn't care about your jamming fields. David clenched his jaw in a specific, rhythmic sequence. Beneath his skin, the transponder activated. It didn't send a message. It simply severed a quantum-locked particle pair, instantly mirroring the state to a receiver buried beneath 2 miles of ice on Jupiter's moon, Europa. It was a single pulse. A digital flare shot into the deepest, darkest night. It carried 3 pieces of data. Sarah Jenkins is dead. David Holloway is captive. Here is the exact location of the fleet that did it. Korvath stared at the human, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his alien features. But his arrogance quickly smothered it. He waved a dismissive gauntlet. Throw him in the observation brig. Let him watch through the viewport as we plot a course to his dead homeworld. If there's anything left to burn in the Sol system, I want him to see the ashes. The Vorn guards dragged David backward. He didn't fight them. He just kept his eyes on Sarah's body until the blast doors slid shut, sealing her away forever. He was alone in the dark, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled his very soul, that the dark was about to answer back. For 3 standard planetary rotations, the Obsidian Crown drifted near the edge of the Perseus Veil, surrounded by its escort fleet of 30 heavy cruisers. High Fleet Admiral Korvath was in no rush. He was savoring the victory. To the Vorn, war was not merely a political tool, it was a biological imperative. To crush a lesser species was to honor the cosmos. Humanity had been a thorn in the hegemony's side for the better part of a decade. They were a bizarre, stubborn race that fought with archaic kinetic weapons and crude fission drives, yet somehow managed to hold the line at the Sirius sector, turning it into a meat grinder that cost the Vorn millions of warriors. But that was years ago. The hegemony's intelligence network had concluded that Earth's economy had collapsed, their industrial capacity shattered by orbital bombardments. The humans were done. Catching their top intelligence operatives creeping through hegemony space was just the final proof. In the ship's observation brig, suspended in a stasis webbing that kept his limbs immobilized, David Halloway watched the stars. Sub-Commander Krellin, Korvath's second-in-command, stood on the other side of the energy barrier, watching the human. Krellin was younger than Korvath, less blinded by religious zeal and more attuned to the cold, hard mathematics of warfare. Something about the human unnerved him. "You have not requested sustenance," Krellin said, his translator implant rendering his clicks and hisses into flawless, if sterile, English. "Nor have you entered the despair state common to mammalian species facing execution." David didn't look at the alien. His eyes were fixed on the vast expanse of the void outside the reinforced viewport. "Sustenance implies I plan on being here for dinner," David said, his voice a dry rasp. Krellin shifted uncomfortably. "Your mate was terminated. Your homeworld is a desolate rock. Your fleet is a collection of derelict scrap. What is the source of this illogical defiance? It is a statistical anomaly." David finally turned his head. The stasis webbing cast a sickly green pallor over his bruised face. He looked exhausted, starved, and deeply hollowed out by grief. But behind his eyes, a furnace was burning. "You read the intelligence reports on us, Krellin, right?" David asked, using the alien's name, which caused the sub-commander's dorsal plates to flare in surprise. "You think we're scavengers. You think Earth is dead." "It is a proven fact," Krellin countered. 3 of our stealth probes penetrated the Sol system 12 cycles ago. They recorded massive radiation spikes, widespread atmospheric degradation on Earth. Your orbital rings were shattered. The orbital shipyards in the Mars-Jupiter belt were powered down. It was the signature of a dying civilization consuming its last resources. A slow, terrifying smile cracked David's cracked lips. "You saw radiation spikes in powered-down shipyards. You saw atmospheric degradation." He let out a dry, rattling chuckle. "You idiots!" Krellin slammed a heavy-plated fist against the energy barrier. "Explain yourself, human." "When a blacksmith is forging a sword, Krellin, he doesn't care about the smoke in the room," David whispered. "He doesn't care about the heat. He shuts down everything else, every other project, every other distraction, and he pours every ounce of fuel into the furnace." Krellin's mandibles twitched. He accessed his datapad, bringing up the archival scans of the Sol system. He looked at the massive radiation blooms over the Martian shipyards. He looked at the atmospheric smog choking Earth. "We didn't die," David said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a 10-year grudge. "We went dark. We stopped building civilian cruisers. We stopped building colony ships. We stripped the titanium from our skyscrapers. We grounded our merchant fleets to melt down their hulls. We took every nuclear reactor on Earth, Mars, and Luna, and we bolted them onto the ugliest, heaviest, most brutal frames of metal we could engineer. David leaned forward against the stasis web, his eyes boring into the alien. We stopped being a civilization, Krellin. We became a weapon. And you just gave them the targeting data. Before Krellin could respond, a shrill, piercing klaxon shattered the quiet of the observation deck. The ambient lighting snapped from cool blue to a violent, strobing red. Krellin tapped his communicator. "Bridge, this is Sub-Commander Krellin. Report on the general alarm." "Sub-Commander?" The voice of the sensor officer crackled, panicked, and pitched high. "We are detecting a spatial anomaly, Sector 44 Tactical. It is massive." "A spatial anomaly? A collapsing star?" "Negative. It is localized. The gravitational constants are failing. Space-time is tearing. Something is ripping a hole in the vacuum from the other side." Krellin looked back at the human. David Halloway was no longer looking at him. He was looking out the viewport, staring into the empty blackness of space. "God forgive us," David murmured softly, tears finally tracking down his dirty cheeks. Not tears of fear, but of profound, overwhelming grief, because he knew the cost of what was about to happen. They actually did it. On the command bridge, High Fleet Admiral Korvath stared at the massive holographic tactical display in sheer disbelief. Space did not bend this way. The Vorn used quantum displacement drives elegant, precise, slipping vessels through the subspace membrane with barely a ripple. But the readings flooding the bridge's main console defied every known law of hegemony astrophysics. "Report!" Korvath roared, gripping the edge of the holodable so hard his gauntlets dented the metal. "Admiral, gravitational shear is exceeding. Class 9 parameters," the tactical officer screamed over the blaring alarms. "It's not a jump portal. It's a brute force tear. Something is subjecting local spacetime to localized singularities, ripping the fabric open by sheer kinetic force." "Nothing can survive that kind of transit," Korvath snarled. "The tidal forces would crush any hull." "Sir, the tear is stabilizing. Cherenkov radiation is blinding our optical sensors. Something is coming through." Outside the obsidian crown, the black canvas of space literally fractured. It didn't open like a door, it shattered like a mirror. A blinding, searing flash of pure white radiation washed over the Vorn fleet, instantly frying the outer sensor suites of 3 escort cruisers. Then, out of the tearing, bleeding wound in reality, came Earth's last fleet. Korvath's optical sensors polarized to filter the glare, and when the image resolved on the main screen, the bridge fell into a stunned, horrified silence. They were not elegant. They did not have the sweeping, predatory lines of Vorn warships. They were brutalist nightmares of engineering. Millions of tons of dark, scarred metal welded together in jagged, asymmetrical configurations. They looked like floating megacities, encased in thick, ablative asteroid rock, strapped with massive engines that bled dirty, radioactive plasma into the void. At the center of the formation was a vessel so obscenely massive, its own mass was dragging smaller asteroids from a nearby belt into its orbit. Stenciled on the scarred, slab-like prow in faded, chipped white paint were the letters UES Oppenheimer. Flanking the flagship were hundreds of dreadnoughts, destroyers, and carriers. The UES Verdun, the UES Carthage, the UES Rubicon. The names of human history's greatest slaughters, resurrected in steel and atomic fire. They bore the scars of a desperate, frenzied construction. Parts of orbital elevators were used as structural spines. The hulls were a patchwork quilt of mismatched armor plating, cannibalized from fallen ships and stripped cities. Vessel count. Admiral, vessel count is exceeding 400 capital ships, the tactical officer whispered, his voice trembling. Power signatures are, I don't understand. They are using unregulated, weaponized fission-fusion hybrids. They are essentially riding continuous nuclear detonations to propel themselves. "Open a channel!" Korvath demanded, his arrogance finally cracking under the sheer, oppressive weight of the human armada. "Demand their surrender. Prime the main plasma batteries. Order the fleet into the crescent formation." The Vorn fleet scrambled to respond. 30 beautifully crafted, technologically superior cruisers adjusted their vectors, their sleek weapons powering up, glowing with refined plasma energy. "Channel open, Admiral." Korvath puffed out his chest, projecting his voice across the void. "Unknown human fleet, you have entered hegemony space. You are in violation of—" A harsh analog burst of static cut him off. The human fleet didn't send a holographic emissary. They didn't send a diplomatic envoy. A voice, heavily distorted by distance and primitive encryption, echoed over the Obsidian Crown's bridge. It was deep, weary, and entirely devoid of mercy. It belonged to Fleet Admiral Thomas Bradley, a man who had not slept soundly in 10 years. "Vorn Hegemony Fleet," Bradley's voice rasped. "This is the United Earth Naval Authority. 3 hours ago, you executed Captain Sarah Jenkins. You did not ask for a surrender. You will not receive one." "Fire!" Korvath screamed, realizing instantly that this was not a negotiation. But humanity had not traveled across the galaxy to fight a traditional war. Before the Vorn cruisers could fully charge their plasma batteries, the UES Oppenheimer and its vanguard fired. There were no bright flashes of laser light. There were no elegant energy beams. Humanity used railguns, massive, ship-spanning magnetic accelerators designed to hurl multi-ton slugs of depleted uranium at a fraction of the speed of light. The silence of space was broken by the visual horror of kinetic devastation. The human munitions crossed the distance between the fleets in a fraction of a second. The Vorn energy shields, designed to absorb and dissipate heat and plasma, reacted poorly to pure, unadulterated mass, moving at relativistic speeds. The lead Vorn cruiser, Pride of the Ascendant, simply ceased to exist. A depleted uranium slug the size of a city bus, traveling at 0.2 C, struck the cruiser dead center. The Vorn shielding flared blindingly white for a microsecond before shattering. The kinetic transfer was so absolute that the cruiser didn't just explode, it shattered into a billion pieces of microscopic shrapnel, the friction instantly turning its atmosphere into a localized star. The shockwave in the local debris field battered the Obsidian Crown. "Shields at 40%! The tactical officer screamed, bleeding from his auditory canals. "Admiral! Their projectiles are piercing our kinetic barriers. They are just throwing mass at us." "Return fire! All ships, return fire!" The Vorn fleet unleashed a volley of plasma torpedoes and continuous beam lasers. The dark space between the armadas lit up in a dazzling display of blue and green destruction. The alien weaponry struck the human ships. Plasma washed over the UES Verdun, melting away tons of ablative armor. Lasers sliced deep gouges into the side of the UES Carthage. But the human ships didn't break formation. Their armor was absurdly, comically thick. They had designed their ships not to evade enemy fire, but to absorb it. Where a Vorn ship relied on shields and agility, the human fleet relied on 10 meters of solid titanium, reinforced concrete, and raw, stubborn mass. The UES Verdun, its port side glowing cherry red from a plasma strike, didn't even adjust its course. It simply rotated its secondary batteries and unleashed a swarm of thousands of unguided, dirty fission missiles. It was an overwhelming mathematical barrage. It was an assault devoid of elegance or honor. It was a street fight brought to the stars. Down in the observation brig, David Halloway felt the deck heave under his feet as the dreadnought took a grazing hit from a railgun slug. The inertial dampeners whined and failed for a second, throwing him hard against the stasis web. Sub-Commander Krellin was on the floor, struggling to stand as the ship shook violently. He looked up at David, his alien eyes wide with a terror he had never known. "They are destroying themselves!" Krellin shouted over the ship's alarms. "Their engines are redlining! Their armor is melting! It is suicide!" David looked out the viewport. He watched as the UES Rubicon took a concentrated barrage of Vorn plasma fire. The ship was dying. Its engines were venting radioactive fire into space. But instead of turning away, the Rubicon accelerated, aiming its massive, broken prow directly at a Vorn heavy cruiser. A kamikaze strike of a 2-million-ton dreadnought. The Rubicon slammed into the Vorn ship, driving it backward through the void before detonating its own fusion core in a blinding, catastrophic explosion that consumed them both. "They aren't here to win a tactical engagement, Krellin," David said softly, the green light of the stasis web reflecting in his cold, dead eyes. Then why are they here? Krellin screamed, watching his invincible fleet being torn apart by flying scrap metal and nuclear fire. They're here for her, David whispered, looking back at the blast doors where Sarah had been taken. They're here to make sure you never, ever forget her name. Outside, the UES Oppenheimer charged its main spinal weapon. The space around the dreadnought began to distort as the gravitational stabilizers strained to hold the ship together. Earth's last fleet had finally arrived, and they had brought hell with them. Aboard the command bridge of the UES Oppenheimer, there was no polished obsidian, no acoustically dampened flooring, and no holographic elegance. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of leaking coolant. Red emergency lighting bathed the deck in a hellish glow, casting long shadows across the faces of the crew. They wore bulky, pressurized hazard suits, a grim necessity on a flagship whose own nuclear engines were constantly threatening to irradiate its inhabitants. Fleet Admiral Thomas Bradley stood at the center of the chaos, his hands gripped tightly behind his back. He was a man carved from old, weathered granite, his eyes carrying the ghosts of 3 billion casualties. "Shielding on the Carthage is failing, Admiral," reported Commander Catherine Caldwell, her voice clipped and professional over the bridge's crackling intercom, though her hands flew across the analog tactical boards with frantic speed. "They're taking concentrated continuous beam fire from 3 Vorn heavy cruisers." Bradley didn't blink. He watched the tactical display, a massive, pixelated screen cobbled together from salvaged civilian monitors. The Carthage, a dreadnought built around the skeletal frame of the former Shanghai orbital elevator, was burning. "Tell Captain Hayes to redirect all remaining auxiliary power to the forward magnetic accelerators," Bradley ordered, his voice an unnerving calm in the eye of the hurricane. "If the Carthage is going down, she takes her executioners with her." Out in the void, the Carthage did exactly that. Stripped of its crude kinetic barriers, the dreadnought's hull began to boil under the Vorn lasers. But instead of rotating to protect its exposed flank, the massive ship surged forward. Its twin railguns, spanning the length of a city block, glowed with blinding electromagnetic fury. They fired in unison. At point-blank range, the depleted uranium slugs didn't just pierce the Vorn cruisers, they ripped them in half. The kinetic shockwave from the impacts shattered the alien formations, sending tumbling, burning debris crashing into neighboring hegemony vessels. A second later, the Carthage's fusion core finally breached, consuming the ship and its remaining attackers in a silent, blossoming sphere of miniature sunfire. "Carthage is gone, sir," Caldwell said softly. "Mark them in the ledger," Bradley replied, his jaw tightening. "Concentrate fire on the hegemony flagship. I want the Obsidian Crown crippled, not vaporized. Target their main propulsion and their quantum displacement drives. We are not letting Korvath leave this graveyard." Aboard the Obsidian Crown, High Fleet Admiral Korvath was watching his invincible armada disintegrate. The hegemony doctrine was built on the premise of elegant superiority. Their shields were meant to refract energy. Their hulls were meant to slip past torpedoes. They were entirely unprepared for a species that treated a 2-million-ton dreadnought as a disposable munition. The sheer volume of kinetic mass humanity was throwing at them was overloading their defensive grids. "Admiral! The human flagship is charging a massive energy signature!" the sensor officer shrieked, his mandibles vibrating with panic. "It is not a kinetic weapon. It is a concentrated, localized gravity well. They are aiming at our primary drive section." "Evasive maneuvers," Korvath bellowed. "Full power to the aft deflectors. Engage the quantum drive. Get us out of here." "Quantum matrix is failing," the officer's console sparked, raining blue sparks over his chitinous hands. "The radiation from their dirty fission drives has polluted local subspace. We cannot form a stable jump bubble. We are anchored in normal space." Korvath felt a cold, alien dread coil in his primary stomach. For the first time in his long, decorated life, he was not the apex predator. He was cornered prey. The UES Oppenheimer fired its spinal weapon. It was not a traditional projectile. It was a breech-bore torpedo the size of a skyscraper, driven by a localized singularity engine. The torpedo crossed the battlefield in a heartbeat, ignoring the blazing plasma fire trying to shoot it down. It struck the aft section of the Obsidian Crown with world-ending force. The Vorn dreadnought shuddered so violently that gravitational stabilizers ripped from their bulkheads. The torpedo didn't explode. Instead, it embedded itself deep into the alien hull, its singularity engine rapidly reversing polarity. It generated a localized gravity crush that instantly crushed the Vorn's quantum engines into a ball of super-dense scrap metal, rendering the flagship dead in the water. Main power is down. We are adrift. Korvath staggered to his feet, pulling his ceremonial plasma sidearm from his hip. Seal the bulkheads! Prepare for boarding! They will attempt to take the ship. We will drown them in their own blood. But the humans hadn't just fired one torpedo. From the belly of the Oppenheimer and the surviving human dreadnoughts, hundreds of smaller, unguided projectiles launched into the void. They were barely more than titanium cylinders wrapped in ablative shielding, burning hard on chemical rockets. To the Vorn sensors, they looked like debris. But they weren't. They were drop pods. Commander Krellin, Korvath snarled into his wrist communicator, trying to reach the observation brig. Execute the human prisoner. Then bring your guard detachment to the bridge. We will make a final stand. There was no answer. Only the horrifying rhythmic thud of titanium pods slamming into the Obsidian Crown's outer hull, like nails being driven into a coffin. Major Michael O'Donnell didn't feel the impact so much as he survived it. His drop pod, designated Gravewalker 1, pierced 3 layers of the Vorn dreadnought's ablative armor before coming to a violent, neck-snapping halt deep within the ship's portside logistics corridor. The pod's explosive bolts fired, blowing the hatch outward. O'Donnell stepped into the alien ship, his heavy magnetic boots clamping onto the polished floor. He was clad in bulky, scarred tactical armor, holding an 8-gauge kinetic scattergun, a weapon so primitive the Vorn sensors barely registered it as a threat until it was too late. Behind him, 30 Marines poured out of the surrounding pods. They didn't shout. They didn't rally with battle cries. They moved with the cold, silent efficiency of executioners. We have an airtight seal on Deck 4, O'Donnell ordered, checking the crude telemetry monitor strapped to his forearm. Objective is the command bridge and the observation brig. No prisoners, no wounded. If it has scales, mandibles, or holds a weapon, you turn it into a memory. Move. The Vorn subjugators met them at the first junction. The towering alien warriors, wielding elegant glowing plasma halberds, charged the human invaders, expecting the mammals to break under the sheer psychological terror of close-quarters combat. O'Donnell leveled his scattergun and pulled the trigger. The weapon roared, kicking back with enough force to bruise his shoulder through the armor. A cloud of jagged tungsten buckshot shredded the Vorn energy shields, which were designed to stop fast-moving energy, not slow, heavy shrapnel, and tore through the subjugator's chitinous chestplate. The alien collapsed, green blood hissing against the deck. The corridor devolved into a slaughterhouse. The humans fought like cornered wolves, using their kinetic firearms, combat knives, and raw, physical brutality to carve a path through the Vorn defenders. They didn't care about the hegemony's divine right to rule. They only cared about the debt that was owed. Deep in the ship, the power grid flickered and died, plunging the observation brig into emergency red lighting. The energy barrier keeping David Halloway pinned to the stasis, Webb sputtered, fizzled, and collapsed. David dropped to the floor, his knees slamming painfully into the obsidian deck. He gasped for air, his muscles screaming in agony after days of forced immobility. Across the room, Sub-Commander Krellin stood holding a plasma pistol. His hands were shaking. The Vorn officer could hear the echoing booms of human shotguns reverberating through the ship's ventilation systems. He could hear the screams of his warriors dying. David slowly pushed himself up to his feet. He looked at Krellin. He didn't look like a defeated prisoner. In the bloody red light, staring through his bruised and battered face, David looked like the Grim Reaper incarnate. Krellin raised the pistol, aiming it at David's chest. Admiral Korvath ordered your execution. I know, David rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't raise his hands. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. Stop, Krellin clicked nervously, taking a step back. I will fire. My duty requires it. Your duty just got your entire species a front-row ticket to extinction, Krellin, David said, taking another step. You looked at our dead planet and thought we were defeated. But you missed the grand finale. What finale? Krellin demanded, his mandibles trembling. You threw your entire fleet at us in a suicidal rage. What comes after this? Even if you kill us, your homeworld is a poisoned wasteland. You have nothing left." David stopped mere inches from the barrel of the plasma pistol. He looked deep into Krellin's digitized optics. "That's the twist, Krellin," David whispered softly. "Those ships outside, the Oppenheimer, the dreadnoughts, they aren't just warships." Krellin froze. The tactical data from the battle flashed through his mind, the bizarre, bloated sizes of the human ships, the massive, shielded compartments buried behind the armor plating, the desperate, frenzied way they fought to protect the core vessels. "They're arcs," Krellin breathed out, horror washing over him. "Earth is empty," David confirmed, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Every man, woman, and child we had left is on those ships. We packed up our entire civilization. We didn't come here to fight a border skirmish. We came here to take your space. We are the apocalypse, Krellin, and you invited us in." Krellin stared at the human. The absolute, unadulterated madness of the human strategy broke something fundamental in the Vorn's rigidly logical mind. To abandon a homeworld, to weaponize a diaspora. It was a level of spite the universe had never seen. Slowly, Krellin lowered the pistol. He dropped it to the floor. "Korvath is on the bridge," Krellin said, his voice hollow. "The female's body is in the stasis morgue, adjacent to command." David picked up the heavy alien pistol. He checked the plasma charge, the weapon humming in his grip. He looked at Krellin for a long moment, then turned and walked out the shattered blast doors. "May your gods have mercy on you," Krellin whispered to the empty room, "because you have none for us." 10 minutes later, the blast doors to the command bridge were blown inward by a human breaching charge. Smoke and debris filled the room. High Fleet Admiral Korvath stood by the command holotable, surrounded by the bodies of his elite guards. Major O'Donnell and his Marines fanned out, their weapons trained on the massive alien commander. Korvath stood tall, adjusting his ceremonial armor, refusing to show fear. "I demand the right of parley!" As the High Fleet Admiral of "Shut up," a voice cut through the smoke. The Marines parted, lowering their weapons slightly. David Halloway walked onto the bridge. He was limping, covered in his own blood and grime, holding Krellin's plasma pistol at his side. Korvath looked at the human, his optical sensors narrowing. "The emissary. You survived, good. You will serve as my hostage to negotiate a ceasefire with your Admiral Bradley." David didn't stop walking. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He didn't seek a confession. He closed the distance between them with terrifying silence. Korvath realized a second too late that the human was not here to talk. The Vorn Admiral raised his massive gauntlet to strike, but David was already moving. David brought the plasma pistol up, jammed the barrel directly underneath Korvath's atmospheric collar, and pulled the trigger. The weapon discharged with a blinding flash, blasting a hole straight through the Vorn Admiral's neck and severing his spinal column. Korvath didn't even have time to register the pain. His massive, armored body stood frozen for a split second before collapsing backward, hitting the obsidian floor with a thunderous crash. David stood over the body, his chest heaving, the pistol smoking in his hand. He stared at the dead alien, feeling absolutely nothing. No triumph, no joy, just a cold, empty void. Major O'Donnell stepped up beside him, resting a heavy, armored hand on David's shoulder. "You good, Commander?" David dropped the pistol. It clattered against Korvath's armor. "Where is she, Mike?" O'Donnell gestured to the side of the bridge. "Morgue Annex. We secured it. She's in a preservation pod." David walked past the Marines, past the burning consoles, and entered the annex. The room was bathed in a soft white light. In the center, resting in a clear, cryogenic stasis field, was Captain Sarah Jenkins. The blood had been cleaned from her uniform. She looked peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping. David placed his hand on the cold glass of the pod. His legs finally gave out, and he slid down to his knees, his forehead resting against the barrier. The tears he had held back for 3 days finally broke, racking his body with silent, violent sobs. He was alive. But the cost was unfathomable. The radio on O'Donnell's shoulder hissed to life. It was Admiral Bradley. Major O'Donnell, sight trip. Bridge is secure, Admiral, O'Donnell replied quietly, watching David grieve. Corvath is dead. We have Commander Halloway. We have Captain Jenkins. Understood, Bradley's weary voice crackled. The Vorn fleet is completely neutralized. We are taking heavy casualties, but the arcs are secure. What is the status of the Obsidian Crown's life support? Online and stable, sir. It's a hell of a ship. Good, Bradley said. Tow her into the center of the formation. Paint over their crest. This is our flagship now. We have a long way to go and an entire hegemony to dismantle. David slowly stood up. He looked at Sarah's face one last time, making a silent promise to the ghost of the woman he loved. He wiped his face, his eyes hardening into chipped flint. He turned and walked back out onto the bridge, looking out the massive viewport. The space around them was a graveyard of alien metal. But among the wreckage, the brutal, ugly, indomitable ships of Earth's last fleet were forming up. Millions of human souls riding on a wave of atomic fire and absolute defiance, venturing into the dark. The Vorn had executed a human. In return, humanity was going to execute an empire. Are you ready to witness humanity's ultimate revenge against the stars? If this epic sci-fi tale of defiance, vengeance, and Earth's unstoppable spirit kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button! Share this story with your friends to show them what happens when aliens mess with the wrong species. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more heart-pounding HFY dramas and sci-fi battles. The galaxy will never be the same.